Welcome, Westside family, and we're continuing our study of Genesis chapters 12 through 50. Today we are finishing up this week's second half. We covered chapters 36 and 37 on Wednesday. I apologize. Down in the corner of my last video, I noticed that I had written the wrong chapters. I'm pretty sure you figured that out okay, and we're in the right place, but I sure apologize. It was right on all the questions and those kinds of things. So you had that in your possession. But somehow I did that. Once you record this and I save it, I can't edit. I can't edit that without redoing the whole thing. And I discovered it too late. So today we've got the right ones on there, and anxious to begin with you and talk about the story of Judah and Tamar, which is a very fascinating story, but interesting of why it's in the text where it is. And then we resume with the Joseph story, of course, in Potiphar's house and what happens to him because of Potiphar's wife taking an interest in him. Okay, so let's begin then with what is called the story of, of Judah and Tamar. And remember, Judah is the fourth son of Jacob. That's going to play into this story in an important way, and we'll be indicating that as we go along. But just realize that's part of the importance of knowing the position of Judah in the family. So this story then is about him. It's about basically what happens when he does some things that are just really wrong judgment, bad judgments, and then even sin, as we have seen so far. That the Bible is not will not gloss over the people that are its leaders if they sin. It's not squeamish about telling us about that, and again, that's one of the great, I think, great proofs that the Bible is indeed inspired by God, because men would gloss over that. You just look at the Soviet Union, the communist leaderships, how they try to cover their mistakes and all of the glaring murders they've committed and all of that kind of thing that they just don't want anyone to know about. Just think about anybody, even the politicians in our country. So it is a great proof, I think, of the Bible's inspiration. Okay, so in chapter 38 and verse 1, we begin with the story of Judah and Tamar. Now, this chapter has been the source of a lot of consternation with commentators and theologians because it just interrupts the Joseph story. We started Joseph last week. They've sold him into, stripped him of his robe, convinced their father that a wild beast had eaten him, killed him, and then for 22 years they'll keep that away from their father until, of course, by what seems to be great chance, and yet we know by providence that God has preserved, Joseph and his brothers are reunited with him. But why does it interrupt the Joseph story at the height of the drama? We have just begun it. And so a lot of course, you can imagine liberal theologians have believed it was inserted at a much later time and that it's not part of the original text, and on the kind of garbage goes in relationship to what they think about the Bible. But remember that the section in chapter 37 and verse 2 begins with these words: These are the generations of Jacob. And they're not talking about the generations of Joseph. The story is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We need to always remember that. They are the three patriarchs, okay? So it is the covenant promises being fulfilled by God because of their faithfulness, of course, to him, and that God is fulfilling his part of that great covenant through the patriarchs. So Joseph and Judah are sons of Jacob, and we cannot forget that. This story of Joseph continues the generation of Jacob. All right, and that's how each of those sections will begin when they begin to talk about in Genesis one of the main characters in the Bible. All right, so Joseph's story is the longest in the Bible, but it has the most impact because the people will have to move to Egypt in order to grow into that great nation, and then God can bring them back at the time that the Amorites' iniquity is full. And so the purpose of Genesis, as well as the purpose of the Bible, is not to tell us an ongoing story about Joseph. And as interesting as that is, and fascinating as it is a story, it is to tell us about the messianic promise, that great promise in the Abrahamic covenant that through the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through an offspring that would come from them, a physical descendant, all nations of the earth would be blessed. So we never must lose sight of the messianic import of the Bible as a whole and of Genesis 2. So, chapter 37, telling us about Judah and Tamar, gives us the lineage of the ancient ancestors of the Christ, of the Messiah. And that point is important to the whole story. So, I believe that is one of the chief reasons why we see it right here. And we'll see another reason when we get to chapter 39 of why Joseph appears then later to take the role of leadership. Obviously, God's given it to him by making him second in command in all of Egypt when all of the sons and Jacob come down to Egypt to live there. So it happened at that time. What time? When they had sold their brother Joseph into slavery. So we know that's 22 years. Remember that he was 17, chapter 37, verse 2, most likely 17. I mean, it seems like that's what the text is telling us when that event happens. He's 30 when he comes to power in chapter 41, 46. And then there are 7 years of plenty and 2 years of famine. So he's 39 then. So 39 minus 17 is the 22. So 22 years are packed into this chapter, and we have to remember that. Again, another point about the Bible's not always in chronological order, because this tells a story of Judah having 3 sons. They grow up, the sons grow up themselves. They marry, and 2 of them die, and then the third one is still too young to marry, but that's according to Judah, and he may have not been very much too young, as we would think that most people in that day, as was common in most agricultural societies, including our own. A lot of people, for instance, back in the 1950s, probably from there forward, the ages of marriage increased, but a lot in the 50s and before that were in their late teens when they got married. And so you can imagine that that would be the same back into this ancient time. All right, so at verse 2 through 5, it says that Judah took Shua, who's the daughter of a Canaanite. So you can imagine that already is the bad judgment that Judah is making. He is marrying a Canaanite, which Abraham and Isaac had expressly forbid their sons. In that case, Abraham forbidding Isaac, Isaac forbidding Jacob to marry a Canaanite. And always, folks, we've seen it before with Dinah at Shechem. Every time they get involved with the Canaanites, there is disaster. Esau marrying the 2 Canaanite women. They are not good people for the most part. Yes, there are exceptions like Melchizedek at Jebus, or what we call Jerusalem, in the days of Abraham. Obviously, the cup of the Amorites' iniquity is not yet full, so there'll be some exceptions to that. But for the most part, they are a people destined to be destroyed because of the wickedness of them. All right, from Judah and Shua then come 3 sons, Onan, and Shula, or Shelah. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing it like his wife's name. So we are told at verse 7, it just becomes so wicked that the Lord puts him to death. Now, we don't have any details. It just says that's what happened. But listen to this, folks. That's the first person in the Bible named. I mean, we know we have the flood, other incidents like that of people being killed by God. But he's the first named person who gets that terrible epitaph that God killed him in a judicial judgment. And God has the right, folks, to do that. He's going to consign most of humanity to hell because of their lives, because of the choices they have for all eternity. God is the great judge, and that comes out again and again and again in the book of Genesis. That God has the right to judge individuals and nations because he created us. In verses 8 through 10, because dies, Judah commands Onan, the second brother, to go into Tamar. I didn't mention that had married Tamar. And so at verses 8 through 10, he tells Onan, the second son, to go into his brother and raise up offspring to his brother's wife and raise up offspring to his brother. Now that's called levirate marriage, and we've already seen that. In the text, it was widely practiced in the ancient Near East. It will be regulated by God in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, in the law of Moses. It comes much later in the story than where we are. The law of Moses was not, of course, in effect at this time. But nonetheless, it just says to you that not only was it a widely practiced custom, it may seem very, very odd and weird to us, but for a man to die without a male heir, and we have seen that over and over in the book, haven't we? Of the barrenness of the first three matriarchs, that they could not give their uh, husband a male heir was a terrible, terrible tragedy to the man and to the woman too. And they could give their handmaids to them in marriage, but then there was this process of levirate marriage by which the brother his name would not vanish and the offspring would continue in his name. Now, what we're told then next is that Onan did such a wicked thing that God also puts him to death. So now two of the sons of Judah have been put to death. And without being indiscreet, Onan repeatedly had sexual relations with Tamar, but he refused to do the duty, we can put it that way, of levirate marriage. And because he refused to do what was considered honorable and right in that day, and the duty of a brother to his elder brother that had died, and had used that relationship only for his own selfish gratification, that God struck him dead. And that's the reason God struck him dead. That's the reason, and behind that scene, sometimes you have other reasons that are given, but they hold no water. That's the reason that Onan was put to death. Now, it's interesting to me that Judah had led the brothers, remember, in selling Joseph into slavery and then covering up the crime by deceiving their father, Jacob, into thinking that a wild beast had killed Joseph. And so now, in rapid succession, Judah loses two sons to real death and not fake death, as Joseph is still very much alive. So he tells Tamar, therefore, to remain a widow until Shelah, my son, grows up, and I will give him to you, or I will give you unto him when he grows up. So he uses the idea that he's too young, and obviously it seems like Tamar buys that at that point. So we could assume that the boy is just simply too young to be married, even by their standards of early age of marriage. But I believe, as we all can see in the story, is that Judah believes Tamar's bad luck. I mean, fool me once, fool me twice, fool me three times, who's the fool? And so if he were to give his third and final son to her, he views her as bad luck. He has no intention. The text says that he feared that he would die, that Shelah would die. So he's not going to ever give her to him. So the text goes on to tell us that in time, Judah's wife, Shua, dies, and after the appropriate mourning passes, he's single again, and therefore obviously could be tempted. And here's the really important point: Tamar saw that Shelah was grown up and that she had not been given to him. So she had gone back to her father's house. She had remained a widow. Remember that Judah separated himself from his family. He's no longer living, and that's one of the other bad judgments he makes. He's not living among God's people. Where did they get their instruction? Remember, Abraham was to instruct his household in the ways and the statutes of God. We believe that Isaac and Jacob would have been doing the same thing. Jacob's away from the church families, we would say. He's living among the most worldly people that are possible. And this is only going to be a recipe for disaster, as it is every time when a young person or anyone else chooses to separate themselves from God's people. And so Tamar is living nearby somewhere where Judy is, living in her father-in-law's house, notices all of this is taking place. And so she takes action. to ensure that she is not an outcast. Remember, she'll continue to be just an outcast. Remember what was going to happen to the later Tamar that came in the history of David's sons, and you remember that terrible story, and that she would have lived destitute, apparently does, in Absalom's house because she had been misused by Amnon, and now no man would take her. No man would rightfully take her. And so Tamar sheds her widow's garments, it says. So she's been wearing those for however long that period had been since the death of Onan to now. And she dons the garments that we are told of a cult prostitute. Now we know that later from verses 21 and 22. She's not just a normal prostitute that plies that trade in any culture. But a cult prostitute would be those that serve the shrines, the high places that God's prophets will condemn again and again. Why he said, kill the Canaanites, do not intermarry with them. They will drag your son and away from me, and their intermarriages will drag them into that worship because they believe the worship to ensure the fertility of the land. And when you're an agricultural society and you depend on the rains of heaven, that we know later there are famines that happen in Canaan all the time. We've seen it already in the story with Abraham and Isaac, Abraham going to Egypt, Isaac being forbidden to go to Egypt. We've seen it and we'll see it again and again. So how they ensured the fertility, the Canaanites believed, was through the practice of sexual immorality at these shrine places. Sometimes they were married women that would go back to their husbands, but for the time they were the cultic, we say, prostitutes, then they would enter into relations with any man that came. One of the prophets will condemn that later by saying a father and a son go into the same woman, and talk about how disgusting that just very thought is, that how immoral that is. And so it would be looked at as being very common in this day, and not right, but common among the Canaanites. So nothing would have been thought ill of these kind of women in a culture where most people think ill of prostitute. They're not looked up highly because, again, it's not respectable in any society. So since Judah had thwarted Tamar, being a matriarch, she would have been Judah's eldest. Therefore, the line that would have come through Onan would have still been to Ur. But now she will devise a means by which she will secure offspring to Judah. And so when Judah is in the predicament he is, that he has been without his wife, and now he's comforted at her loss, he comes by her, and we begin to see something again of the terrible judgment of his character, of his sin. He sees her and he asks her, come, let me come into you. And she says, what pledge, or rather, what will you give me? And he agrees to give her a goat. Later, you'll see Samson takes a young goat when he goes to see his wife. So was that for a long time the common wages of what somebody would have paid prostitute? It may have well been. What pledge will you give them? What are you going to pledge? In other words, okay, you're going to do this, and we're going to have the transaction, as we would say in a business deal, but I don't have payment yet. They didn't have cash and that type of thing. He wasn't carrying gold on him, and so he wasn't carrying gold, so he had to give a pledge. And Tamar said, give me your signet and your cord and your staff, at verse 18, the second half of verse 18. So that may seem odd to us. What is that? So let's go back and look at some pictures and talk about what this was. The signet that was on the cord, on the left hand of the screen, you can see kind of like a little tiny rolling pin. Some of these are very large. You'll see that in a minute. But a lot of them were only maybe an inch to 2 inches long. They could be bigger than that, as we've said. But you'll notice that it is in size. It's engraved like you would make the impression of a coin. You'd have to engrave a stamp or a die to make that image on the metal. Well, they would do it in clay. And so what you see on the right is that when you would roll that signet out, and guess where we get our word signature from? All right. It's passed down through time that we would have this word signet to describe this same kind of instrument. This was the signature of the man that wore that around his neck. And so when you would seal any kind of deal, contract for land, like Abraham did many years before, buying the cave of Machpelah. Most likely this kind of thing was taking place there. This is actually a Mesopotamian limestone cylinder, as you can see at the bottom, seal, and the impression made by it is the worship of a god named Shamash. And so when they rolled it out on the clay, the soft clay, it would make that picture, as you can see in the screen. Here's a picture of the various sizes that have been discovered, and they're modern impressions. These are not ancient clay strips. That last one was. They found both the clay and the seal together, and there are countless examples of these that have been dug up. So it was widely practiced. This was the way of carrying, as we would say, your driver's license. All right, your identification. How we have to fork it over so many times to prove who we are. This was the way that a man would seal a document or whatever in his day. Here is an example in the museum that's in Brooklyn, in their archives, of an engraving of how in Assyria they would take that seal from around their corner. Notice that you still have the hollow hole all the way through it. And then they would mount that little thing that would have a way you could hold it, and then you could roll it, just like a rolling pin. You think of a woman rolling pin, flattening out dough. They would roll it in the clay and put their signature there. All right, the other thing she wanted was his staff. Now, why would that be important? Well, again, ancient engravings of very significant events and people. For instance, on the left is the Code of Hammurabi, the very top of it. The code itself is engraved in stone. Lots of similarities in the laws of Hammurabi and the laws of Moses. They're not all together identical, but there are lots of similarities in what God would regulate, like Levirate marriage, that you might see in the Code of Hammurabi. Code of Hammurabi is ancient, comes way before even Abraham time, or at least somewhere in that vicinity, but 100,000 years. I'm sorry, 1,000 years, I think, if memory serves me right, more ancient even than Abraham. But there it says the Code of Hammurabi stele at the bottom of the picture there depicts the god Shamash. That was the role we saw a minute ago, so a common god in Mesopotamia, holding a staff. So in his right hand, he's holding a staff, as we would think, that a man would use for a walking stick. He could use for a weapon, but here's another reason he would use it. It had the sign of authority. In the top of the staff, at the head of the staff, there was often incised the signature, as we would say, in the language of whatever that man spoke, would be printed, as we would say, his signature of his name, so that it bore his authority. On the right, you have a relief carving of Darius, the great of Persia, later, many centuries later, because this comes in the time, remember, when Persia comes, holding a scepter and lotus. Guess where we get the idea of scepter in a king's hand? It really was a staff. Look how long that is in his case. And so scepters were very common of monarchs, and monarchs in the ancient world, the ancient Near East, were considered shepherds. Remember how many times the Bible talks about kings being shepherds, particularly the kings of God's people. And so a shepherd always has a staff. And so all of that plays into this. So she's asking, in effect, folks, to go back to the story, Judah gave Tamar his ID card, his driver's license, and his credit card. Right? There's no way that you could separate those things from that man, and no one else would mistake that they belong to anyone else. And Tamar's ensured that by taking both the signet and its cord and the credit card. And so as you know that then the deed was committed between them when Judah sends a goat by his friend. Why he sends it by Adullam, we don't know, but nonetheless, when he goes there, she's no longer there. And so he doesn't want to make a big to-do about that because of obviously the embarrassment that could go both ways. And he just said, let her keep it. So that would be a very dangerous thing for somebody to do, as we will find out as we go on with the story. So in verse 24, it tells us that Judah is informed that Tamar said she is pregnant by immorality. Now I want you to stop and think. Here is a man who kidnapped his own brother, who was part of the group that thought about murdering him, who sold him into slavery and then deceived his father with lies, and those things that he did were capital crimes that were worthy of death. And yet, here the righteous guy that can't, see his own sin, blinded to it, immediately is told that his daughter-in-law has committed immorality, will let her be burned because she's still considered to be part of Judah's home. Judah, the oldest, the oldest one in the house, the father. Is what I'm trying to say, the patriarch. Not that he's among the patriarchs of the Bible, but patriarch using it as a general term. The father rules, which is what that word means. So that Tamar would be considered still a part of his family. So he says, let her be burned. And as they were bringing her out, she now brings out the cord and the signet and the staff and says, by the man, sends word to Judah and says, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And now all the truth comes out. Now, I don't particularly like the idea of the smile on the face of the artist that, Judah obviously looks scared to death, or at least that must be him. But nonetheless, she is showing her absolute innocence in this because Judah's response is she is more righteous than I, and not talking about being righteous in God's eyes, doing what uh, rather the idea of legally right. He's saying, in effect, I didn't do my duty to her. And I promised to give to her Shelah and to bring up a son then to the oldest, that his name might not be wiped out, the firstborn, and then the rest would have been Shelah's and hers. The rest of the sons would have been theirs. I did not do my duty by her, and so she did it for me because she would have been outcast the rest of her days in her father's house as a widow that no one else would marry, and she could be the matriarch in the household of Judah, that the oldest son that would come from her would of course be the one that would rule the line when Judah died. And so she has done that. And what the story tells us is that twins are born to Judah and Tamar, and one of those twins' name is Perez. And that becomes very important because he is in the messianic line. It is through that son of Judah. We know through Judah comes the Messiah, and that will be prophesied by Jacob when he blesses the sons at the end of Genesis. And then right now we're told that. And if you skip over to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 3, and there are other places, for instance, when you get Ruth, the Moabitess, and that line at the end of her book, Perez is in there too, because obviously Boaz descended from Perez eventually, and then finally David. And so when you think about the lineage of Christ, it is anything but pure in the sense of these people doing right. And interestingly, that these other nations that need to be blessed by God's Son coming to the world, there's not this purist idea of genuine Jewish blood. They have Canaanite blood married into them. Rahab, they have Canaanite blood of Tamar, they have the Moabite blood, and so forth. And in some ways, God's saying the Messiah is for everyone. And even working out through the weaknesses of people and the sins of people, still working out the plan that he gave to Abraham and the great covenant that all nations of the earth would be blessed. So once again, the Bible doesn't gloss over the sins of the leaders of his people. It doesn't glorify God's people at the expense of truth. And I believe it's just another confirmation of the Bible's inspiration. Okay, now we return to the story of Joseph. And I believe another reason that's going to come out of this chapter of why this particular story of Judah and Tamar is where it is because of the stark contrast between Joseph and Judah. Think about the fact that Judah is really for Tanamount, the leader of the sons of Jacob. Why do I say that? Well, he's not the oldest, he's the fourth. But remember, Reuben has already removed himself from being considered as the oldest to receive the double portion, to receive the leadership of the house of Jacob, to have that passed on to him because he had slept with Bilhah, one of the wives of Jacob. Even though they were a concubine, secondary wife, he slept with one of the wives of Jacob. And Jacob, when he blesses his son, you can call them blessings, he's going to remember that even years later. His consequences of Reuben's sin makes him no longer be the firstborn. All right, so it naturally would remove then to Simeon, who's the next, and Levi. But why have they been removed? Already we've seen the terrible anger, the horrible brutality in them. And we'll see that come to play, I think, even in the story of Joseph, of which of the sons does Joseph choose? Which of his brothers does he choose to imprison for them to bring back Benjamin, Simeon? And so probably Simeon led in the terrible stuff that was done to Joseph, stripping him of his garments, rough handling him, throwing him in the pit, and then yanking him out and selling him to. You can imagine Simeon is getting a taste of his own medicine. But Levi and Simeon have removed themselves. I mean, the blessing that Jacob's going to give them, again, is not a blessing either. Because of their violent nature, all that, he said, you're going to be scattered throughout the other tribes. In other words, you're just going to disappear for all practical purposes. Now, Levi will redeem themselves because they will become the priestly tribe, and there will be some fine men that come from it. Simeon just disappears. They just become a tribe that inherits inside Judah and just disappears. So guess who that leaves next? Judah. So Judah would de facto be the ruler of the family once Jacob died. But here's a contrast between the two different characters of the men, the stark contrast. The contrast is most clearly illustrated in that Judah sought out a prostitute while Joseph turns down an open invitation as a young man at the height of his hormones raging, and yet he will not commit adultery with Potiphar's wife, and yet Judah just chooses out the moment he passes a prostitute. Again, I think it shows us how the Bible is indicating that Joseph would have not only the right to rule because of what God had picked and God had done with him, but by the character that we see in the two men. Now, Judah's going to redeem himself. There's going to be a lot of things about that he'll become a different man, just as we have seen Jacob become a different man, and Abraham, Isaac, all men must become different men in Jesus Christ and in the Bible. Okay, so Joseph is in Potiphar's house, verses 1 through 6, the very first part of 6. He is sold to Potiphar, we are told, the captain of the guard, an officer of Pharaoh. And it was a position very close to Pharaoh. Maybe, as some commentators suggest, the chief executioner. He has the guard of the king's prisoners, of the ones that would have highly offended Pharaoh and would be politically significant, people that could have caused him great harm. Again, you would need somebody in that position that would be very loyal to Pharaoh. But the reason that Joseph is successful, and again, immediately we're told about that success. He's alone, he's vulnerable, he's separated from his family, a cloud hangs over his future, but he's very successful in Potiphar's house. But it's because 5 times in these 6 verses, 5 times it says, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him at verse 3. The Lord caused all that he did to succeed at the second half of verse 3. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake at the beginning of verse 5. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that the Egyptian had, all he had, at the end of verse 5. So the Lord was with Joseph at the beginning of verse 2 after he is sold in that house. So think about that. God is the reason that Joseph is succeeding. This is not Joseph the hero, as we said. This is about divine sovereignty, God carrying out the Abrahamic covenant promise to play out through Joseph, that through you will have an innumerable seed. The great nation will be developed there in Egypt. All right, so that is a very important point to tie back into chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. All right, so Joseph rises in Potiphar's house to be chief steward, in effect. So as successful as he is, that Potiphar puts everything in his control and thinks about nothing. The only thing he concerns himself about is the food he eats. I'm going to tell you that is a guy that can lead a leisurely life because he has a very, very faithful and dedicated chief steward in Joseph. So the prominent position, and you can imagine the dress that would go along with that he would not have been dressed like the slaves that worked out in the field. He would work in the house and be with his master in a very important position, carry authority, and he's very young, and he's very good looking, we are told. And finally, Potiphar's wife notices that, and she says to him at verse 7, "Lie with me." But he refused. And there is no waffling with him, there's no second thoughts. It is the firm resolve that Joseph has to not commit adultery. And when he talks to her about that, he says, first of all, how could I do this against Potiphar? He has not kept back anything from me. I have everything in his house as if it were mine. The only thing is you, except you. Does that sound like the Garden of Eden? That God had given them all these great blessings, and yet they looked to the one thing they could not have. And you want to talk about the pressure that would be put upon Joseph, the strong temptation, the quick rise to power, the master's unlimited trust in him. And yet he remains faithful to not only Potiphar, but most importantly, at the second half of verse 9, he says the real reason. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph's rule of life is his relationship with God Almighty. It's his faith in God. It's his understanding of what God commands that orchestrates his life and by which Joseph lives his life. How did Joseph come by this knowledge? I mean, where did that come from? Later, we read that it's one of the 10 commandments, not to commit adultery. It is at the core of any healthy society, any healthy church, any healthy family, that somebody would be sexually pure and would only have rights to one's mate in marriage. Again, how did he know that? He has no written code, but that doesn't mean God didn't speak to his will. Remember chapter 18 and verse 19? That I have known Abraham, that he will command his family to keep my statutes and my ordinances and so forth. You can read that verse. And if Abraham was to instruct his family and command his family in the will of God, then that means God revealed the will to them, even though it's not written down. And he would have done so, we presume, to Isaac and to Jacob. And in turn, that is how Joseph would know. I think it's one of the dangers that Judah put himself in. When he removed himself from Jacob, he removed himself from receiving that instruction and constantly being in need of us being reminded again why God makes us to come together every first day of the week and to be reminded in the will of God while we're doing these studies, because we're so weak at times and we give up and we give in to temptation. And not only does she do that, but she speaks to him day after day. Can you imagine the pressure? How easily it would have been for a young man to just have given in to that. And especially to think of the power that he could have thought he could have gained by being her lover. But it says at verse 10, he would not listen to her or be with her. And young people, if you listen to this, or our older people that teach our younger people, those are both important. You cannot listen to the ungodliness, and you cannot be in the presence of it. So many people have made the mistake of hanging around the person that they were tempted to be with. And there is the mistake. The Bible tells us later in the New Testament, flee from sexual immorality, 1 Corinthians 6:18, because it's like a great enemy you cannot do battle with. You cannot succeed against this enemy. The only right course to take in front of it is to flee from it. And of course, we will see that Joseph does that literally, because the next thing that happens is the setup. When none of the men were in the house, does it make you wonder, had she sent them all away? Had she finally decided on this final course? Satan, the prowling lion, seeking every one he may devour. And so at that moment, when Joseph goes into the house to do his duty, his work. Remember, this is not him putting himself in a bad place. He had to work there. He had at times to go there, but I can imagine that Joseph made sure there were other men in the house. But on this occasion, he didn't know about that, and she just ambushes him. She caught him by the garment. All the words, the look, the pressures had failed. And as Kidner says, now she ambushes him, and all is won or lost in a moment. So the ambush is her final way, just grab him, and you can imagine probably she pressed herself against him. All is won or lost in the moment that she thought he may give in. But once again, 2 Timothy 2:22, he literally fled the scene. He just runs away. And but there's where the beginning of some more disaster for Joseph happens. He's been put in an untenable situation. How would he ever overcome the master's wife in a battle of what evidence has happened? He's left his garment on the floor and fled, and so she immediately sees her alibi because obviously she is now a woman scorned, and you know the adage in our language that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And so she had been seducing him, trying, waiting, plotting, and now he has totally the last effort of her and her anger now, just her spewing rage comes out, and she calls them into her household. That's her alibi to show her that I yelled out and he tried to rape me, and so she laid up the garment by her until his master rather, came home. The evidence to convict Joseph. And we are told a very interesting thing at verse 19 and 20 that when the master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, his anger was kindled. Now, a lot of times I think immediately we run to the idea that his anger was kindled against Joseph because he goes and throws Joseph into prison. But you ask that question and you say, well, there's no object to the verb. His anger was kindled. Did Potiphar doubt his wife the story and knew her true character? I believe it was Leupold in his commentary that said the ancient Egyptian women were notoriously noted for their unfaithfulness to their husbands, to their sexual immorality. I mean, later you have the same thing said many hundreds of years later about the Corinthians. To be called a Corinthian girl was a horrible thing because it was tantamount to saying you were a prostitute. But that may be part of what's playing in here. We don't know. He valued Joseph, who had greatly increased his wealth, and now he's put in the untenable situation. He cannot disprove or deny what his wife is telling him without openly impugning her honor and his house and holding up a slave over it. But what should have happened to a slave like Joseph? If he had been committed rape or tried attempted rape against the master's wife, I mean, in any culture, including God's law, he should have been put to death. That's the right, but that's not what Potiphar does with him, is he? He puts him not just in any prison, he puts him in the best prison. And only by that I mean it's still a prison. It's still a pit. Remember, I said to you that the word pit would come up again. Same word used for pit earlier is now used for prison. But you can imagine where the king's prisoners were kept was not kind of like the same dungeon where the worst criminal of the land was kept. Now, it's not a good place to be. I'm not suggesting that. But he doesn't kill him. And I think the point being that he's angry because of the whole incident. He doesn't want to kill the means of his great wealth, but he's got to do something. And the only thing at his disposal is to keep his honor and his house's honor and his wife in this case, is to keep him alive and hope that he can figure out a way out of this dilemma. But God's going to figure that way out for him. But once again, we see Joseph in a terrible place, but it tells us twice, verse 21, verse 23, the Lord was with Joseph. He's not released immediately, folks. He's going to languish there, we know, for up to 2 years later after the butler forgets him and doesn't tell the Pharaoh about him interpreting the butler's dream correctly, also the baker's. But he's forgotten for those 2 years. How much longer had he been there up till the butler is thrown into prison, the baker? So he's not released. God doesn't take that away, and he suffered. And we know he must have suffered because later you read in the Psalms, the whole story in Psalms 105 is one of the historical Psalms of God's people, telling the story in brief. And at chapter 105, verse 17, it says, He had sent a man, God, He had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters. Think about iron fetters being put on his feet like the stocks that later Paul and Silas were put into. His neck was put into a collar of iron. Now, folks, that is an inspired scripture, but it must have come down to them in their oral history, too. That at one point he wasn't treated very well until what he had said came to pass in the interpretation of the dreams. The word of the Lord tested Joseph. Folks, when things happen to us in this life that are bad, we need to go back and read about those great ones that were tested, as James tells us, Patience, the patience of Job, the patience and endurance of people like Joseph to continue to have faith in God and that God will work out good the life of all of his people. We need to put our confidence in him. All right. Thank you for the study that we've done today, and we'll continue the story of Genesis and Joseph next week.